This is episode 217 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, it is great to be here. Another eventful week in New Mexico politics and policy. Plenty to talk about, but last week, as we were getting ready for this particular podcast episode, or last week's episode, we had heard that the courts in New Mexico had given restaurants 10 days to operate indoor dining. Practically by the time I made my way home, or an hour or so later, the state Supreme Court had overturned that, but I wanted to kind of close the loop on that one. And I know you probably have some insider information that you could share with us about the latest. Lots going on in the back and forth over the lockdown, the governor, and of course, the restaurants.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I really do have any insider information, but, you know, this is New Mexico, who knows? So it was filed in district court, a stay of closing restaurants to all indoor dining was granted by this state district court, and the Supreme Court overrode that. So what I found interesting was that, the administration had that order for several days, and they could have replied to the district court. According to the judge, the administration did not, and then the Supreme Court took care of it, and I guess they spent all their time, money, and effort in Santa Fe getting ready for the Supreme Court. So it goes on. You know, the key is that a restraining order on a shutdown tends to lose value. The key is that opening and closing, in addition to just all the other troubles that restaurants are having. That's a huge one, because you have to bring people back on. You have to build up your inventory that's been gone if you haven't had much business, or if you're the sort of restaurants that's not really well suited for drive-through and takeout. And so we'll see what happens. It struck me, and again, this is as a private citizen, I have not looked into the legalities of this, but it just did seem like the process was honored about making the case at the district court. They went straight to the Supreme Court. And I wonder, obviously there's some ability to do that. The government gets special treatment on certain things like elections and others, but this one seemed like maybe they did do not pass go sort of thing. You know, they had a special card to go somewhere else. And so it's going to be interesting. There hasn't been any really quote unquote discovery about what the case was. They didn't make their case. And so it'll all happen here, I guess, here in a few days in Santa Fe before the New Mexico Supreme Court.
Yeah. And we'll have presumably a final ruling then, but the old saying, the wheels of justice turn slowly, I think was thrown out the window very quickly there by the New Mexico Supreme Court. And, you can argue that there was a pro-business element to that, in the sense that you don't want to make businesses go back and forth and get inventory, reopen 10 days, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see how things shake out with New Mexico's Supreme Court. It doesn't mean that they've made a decision, and we'll see what ultimately happens with the court. But definitely the fastest action from a judicial body in the West. I think they may have set a judicial land speed record last Monday.
Yeah, even the election cases that they hear have usually taken a few days to get on the docket and decided. This was in a matter of hours.
Yeah, and of course, that was one that we wanted to just revisit, because things changed so rapidly after we recorded it. But now the governor has issued her latest orders. Schools are shut down for live schooling until after Labor Day, when presumably most of them will go to a hybrid model of partially online, partially in person, although with full masks and social distancing and all those kinds of things. I think Wally and we all have our thoughts and feelings. It wasn't what the governor said or did during her press conference in terms of actual policies. It was her approach. And I think she's moved beyond my worst third or fourth grade school teacher into Nurse Ratched territory from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And she's a famous character in a book where she's talking to these mentally ill people, for lack of a better word, and just Nurse Ratched. You can kind of tell where she's coming from. The finger wagging while she is talking about how naughty we all are for, she says, I can see you at the airports. I can see you on Facebook.
I see you if you're sleeping. I know if you're awake.
And there's a certain bad Santa Claus thing that comes to mind. There's also the Wicked Witch of the West from the Wizard of Oz with her crystal ball looking down on Dorothy and the other folks there, the Tin Man, the Lion, and cackling a little bit. She really is ramping up her, for lack of a better word, totalitarianism, really trying to shame us and say that she knows what we are doing. It's really scary stuff. And it's one thing to have the information and be concerned with it and tracking. It's another thing to be specifically talking about this stuff in such a personal manner and such a nasty manner in one of these press conferences.
Yeah, and what's interesting, it's been very situational for me when I go to stores. There's almost complete compliance. Now there is the occasional person that has their mask riding a little low, which I think defeats most.
Kind of like the blue jeans.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, there you go. So yeah, riding a little low for what's appropriate. So I'm seeing very good compliance. Where I don't see compliance is places where I don't think it matters much anyway.
Right.
If I see people riding their bikes out in rural New Mexico, literally 50 miles from the nearest town, they don't have them on. I've seen hikers. I've seen people out there in the streams fishing, don't have their mask. But when you go to town, everybody has their mask on.
Indoors, certainly.
Yeah.
I walk around downtown Albuquerque, which is a little bit like being out in the great outdoors.
Yeah.
The small number of people that are downtown these days, thanks to Mayor Keller and the riots, et cetera. But slight political jab there from what's going on downtown. But the fact is it's one thing to be in a retail store or in another well-populated enclosed place and to be wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. And I agree with you, in those enclosed areas, overwhelmingly, I'm maybe not 100%, but close, 98, 99% compliance. Whereas out on the street walking or out working out, whatever, you're going to have a lot fewer people out walking the dogs, for example, in the neighborhood wearing masks. You have a few, but it's pretty limited.
Yeah, I think it's very few and very limited. This is a garbage day in my personal residence, and so when I took the garbage out this morning, there was nobody there. Frankly, I didn't think about it, to tell you the truth. So I took out the garbage, but I didn't see anybody. So, was I a scofflaw? Was I violating the law? Was I making it dangerous for my neighbor? I sort of don't think so, but maybe I'm part of the problem.
Depends on what's in that garbage there, Wally.
Well, yeah, there's nothing in that garbage, and divided into its recycling and its non-recycling. Oh my goodness!
Of course.
All right.
There's so much to talk about related to this, but the Albuquerque Journal has a piece, restaurants have highest rapid response rate. And there's a very interesting pie chart. It seems really interesting when you look at it, and it talks about the cases of COVID-19. The first line of the piece is restaurants make up 15% of the New Mexico businesses with at least one COVID-19 positive employee, more than any other industry in the state. Now, it goes on to talk about the situation in various industries, and it implies by implication, and I'm sure this data was given by Lujan Grisham and her administration and her health advisors. But what is not discussed until way down in the piece is that this data, this information translates to roughly 5% of the state's total infected population. Now, businesses, it's like, pre-COVID or even now, if you come back with a real stomach issue after eating in a restaurant, you kind of say, well, oh, that's food poisoning from X, Y, and Z restaurant. You're going to have a lot more tracking. And I know not all restaurants are doing the contact tracing, and there's issues with contact tracing, but going into these establishments, retail, healthcare, construction, supermarket, those are all laid out. And then there's more than a dozen or so other industries and whatnot where they have COVID-19 tracking, where people said, oh, I probably got it here, and then they figure it out. But 5%, where are the other 95% of cases coming from? Where are people actually picking up this particular virus? Now, they could be coming from restaurants. They could be coming from any number of places. But if we only have a window, it's like looking at 5% of an elephant and trying to figure out what the whole elephant looks like. And I just think it's a misguided approach, and it's almost inflammatory to put this kind of thing out into the media.
Yeah, and it is one of those things that statistics are so easy to manipulate to give whatever picture you want to have. And yes, the fact that you see that 15%, you're like, oh, of course it was right, but it's only 5% of the cases. And then when you look at the hospitality industry, restaurants and hotels, which and those sorts of businesses are very large employers as well. So, if the other thing you would want to look at is what is the percent of the COVID cases relative to the percentage of workers in that industry versus others. So you can slice it and dice it a lot of different ways, and people are doing that. I do think that that's one of the things that that the lawsuit that was filed is trying to get a handle on is what was the data used? You said you used data and science. What was the data and science? This was round one. Is this their case? If so, there might be more holes in it than it meets the eye at the beginning, as you so aptly pointed out.
Yeah, and this is data as I looked at it from the New Mexico Environment Department, and I understand it is a difficult challenge to try to track down all these cases. We're having enough challenges with testing and getting results in a timely fashion, and just understanding the way that virus is spread, and the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of masks and other tools. So I don't begrudge them from trying to produce some data, but is this really telling a story, or is this just kind of a grasp to make a political point? Because restaurants do rightly feel like they're being put upon, picked upon, and even the governor said this isn't the restaurants doing this to New Mexicans, this is New Mexicans doing this to restaurants. And I think she seems to be making or trying to make some kind of political point here. We could talk about that for a long time, but we're going to leave that one behind. Wally, Wallet Hub, our friends, have come out with yet another data point showing the relative lockdownedness or openness of various states. And despite the governor continuing to ratchet down the restrictions, ratchet up the restrictions, I say, tighten, making New Mexico less and less free in terms of businesses opening, et cetera. We're now 42nd overall, according to Wallet Hub, meaning that there's a lot of other places, a lot of other states now, including Arizona at 44th, Texas at 46th, Colorado at 47. So normally among the region that we're in, we're always an outlier in being relatively anti-freedom. But as of right now, 3 of our neighboring states are more locked down than the state of New Mexico. Amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. And to tie those two back together, relative lockdownedness, restaurants were allowed to open for indoor dining. They can still have patio dining, which I've seen a fair amount of that around the state. Some places it makes sense, some it doesn't. Las Cruces next to the ag barns on a 105-degree day doesn't make a lot of sense. But I was up in the Taos area. They had some nice patio dining going on there. But we have these categories, and the ones that and I don't know a winery, but the wineries have yet to be able to open. The the key there was the breweries could open, the wineries couldn't. And it was like, why was that?
Right.
What is that about? So the other thing is the level of how closed or how open to commerce a state is. The other statistic I think you need to see with that to really make sense of it is relative to how big of a problem COVID is at that point in the state. Because you can say, well, Hawaii, for example, the last I checked was very locked down, but they have almost no problem. There are states that are having a huge problem that aren't locked down. There's states that are having a huge problem that are very locked down. So even that's all over the place. There is a wealth of data, and as we alluded to in the first part, there's a lot of ways to manipulate it, and it's really quite difficult, I think, to come up with the definitive way to rank these things in terms of this is the best and that it isn't. But these, got to hand it to our friends at Wallet Hub. They always do these reports. They do a good job of it. They disclose their methodology, so it at least gives you some sense of what's going on, what range of activities across states across the great U.S. of A.
Yeah, and of course, Wallet Hub does great data crunching with this information. Now, I think Wally's talking about next level data analysis, which is there any correlation or let alone causation, which is of course the real issue, between states halting the spread of the virus and deaths from the virus and their lockdown situation, or is it largely unrelated? And I know this will be studied for a long time, the effectiveness or lack thereof of these shutdown policies. But we can talk about South Dakota, which had virtually none and yet remains relatively virus-free. Then other states, New York being one prominent one, which is relatively locked down and had serious problems with the virus. And then there's Hawaii, which is very locked down and almost totally virus-free. So where is the sweet spot?
So the point we're making is that there's so many layers of analysis that could happen, and what is the right one to make? As I was thinking about this in terms of restaurant policy, bars being open versus not, you could argue that, well, bars are horrible. But if you have a bar that's well run, that has social distancing, quote unquote, and is using good protocol, that might be far superior to these huge house parties or raves, for lack of a better term, where there's no rules of any kind. And so, like so many things in looking at things from an economic point of view, there are trade-offs, and these are very difficult situations to do. And back to one of my favorite things is anytime somebody says science and data, I tend to roll my eyes because the science is very ill-formed and the data is all over the place. And what does it even mean, and what's the right way to analyze it? Doesn't mean we shouldn't look at data and shouldn't, utilize it to some extent, but to act like there's some magical set of data and magical way of looking at this that's going to make everything better. We've yet to see that with the possibility of, as you said, South Dakota. But believe me, what is the huge metropolitan area of South Dakota? It's a trick question. There isn't one. So definitely a rural state that probably, and who knows, there may be other factors, again, that we don't know about that have contributed to their success. But they are the envy of much of the rest of the country, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we could go into this ad nauseum, but the simple fact is that Rio Grande Foundation very early on came out with, along with Power of the Future New Mexico, fairlyopen.com, which encouraged policymakers, politicians to adopt broad regulations along the lines of what the CDC was putting out, social distancing, et cetera, and that leave it to all the businesses to innovate, to come up with ways to make those policies work, not, for example, shutting down entire industries like wineries while others are open, and shutting down small businesses while big box stores are open, and just trying to put a basic, scientifically understandable and justified set of policies in place so that we can lead as close to normal lives as possible. And I don't know that South Dakota has the silver bullet per se. They don't have major cities, of course. Major cities are not where New Mexico's particularly had its outbreaks. That's New York is a different story.
Parts of Texas, the big cities have struggled.
But Albuquerque, Bernalillo County is not especially hard hit, nor have Doña Ana County or Santa Fe County been especially hard hit. It's been the Four Corners and the native areas, especially Navajo, where South Dakota does have a lot of Native American population and has done much better overall. But again, that's all just illustrating that we don't really have, and policymakers and the government and David Scrace don't really have a firm understanding of everything going on right now and all the different dynamics with regard to the spread and or the death from the virus situation. And I do think we had a lot of these more aggressive policies in place at the outset with flatten the curve, but again, people will be people, and they're not always going to adhere to the diktats coming from Santa Fe or from any other government. And how do you create a situation where people can kind of live their lives a little bit while also being relatively safe? And I don't know that we certainly haven't achieved that in New Mexico. I don't know if there's any other places that have achieved that kind of sweet spot in terms of doing what is necessary to address COVID-19, but also giving people a little more freedom to live their lives in a sustainably long-term manner. Because it's one thing to kind of socially distance, really not see people, really not travel for 3 weeks, a month, but we're 4.5 months in, we're looking like, and getting back to the restaurants, when restaurants were closed the first time, I didn't see a lot of emphasis on tents and whatnot. Now, granted, it is summertime and there's also a lot of rain falling on our heads from the monsoons. That's impacting the situation. But the investment in tents at a lot of the restaurants and these outdoor establishments is leading me to believe that they're in it for the long haul. They see this situation as being in place for a while. And I would concur with them that we're nowhere near the end of even the indoor dining ban unless she's overturned by a court. But it seems like this is more of a new normal, to use a horrible term.
Yeah, and the thing as we look at this is that how long does this go on? Because, we heard just a few short months ago, this is going to go on until there's a vaccine. There's a lot of promising vaccines out there, but you also read that maybe these vaccines don't have as long of a value in terms of boosting immunity. And so, yes, this could be a long, long, long haul. And as we talked, this whole idea about there is protecting of people from COVID versus allowing our economy to go forward. And again, I define the economy as that which sustains us.
Yes.
That which grows our food, which provides our utilities, which builds our houses, which, and there was a time when clothing stores were not considered essential. Well, over the long term, clothing's right up there as essential, and many things are essential in our economy. And I don't think you want to destroy the economy, particularly in a place like New Mexico that's a poor state. And as we've seen from the federal government, for the federal government to do anything, even though I won't say it's not meaningful, it's meaningful and substantial, but it doesn't solve the problem, and it costs trillions and trillions of dollars. And I don't think the United States can go forward, spending 5, 10, 15, 20 trillion dollars more money than they bring in month after month, year after year, without there eventually being some fantastic collapse of our currency and all the bad things that have happened with that over time.
Yeah, and we'll at some point talk about the prospects for a further federal stimulus package for the states and whatnot. And we've already done $3.1 trillion. How many more trillions of debt can we pile up? But I just want to flag a few items for folks. One is a lot of folks who listen to this podcast probably also receive imprimis from Hillsdale College. They always publish interesting articles and good things, but this time around, the May-June edition is Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. 4 months of unprecedented government malfeasance. It is a fantastic article talking about a number of things relating to COVID-19, the riots, etc. Definitely worth your time. And then last week we had Catherine, actually 2 weeks ago, Catherine Stevens from the American Enterprise Institute on. She did a interview with Channel 4 KOB, report questions results of NM lawmakers pre-K study with Patrick Hayes. Check that out. We will be sure to send that around to the Rio Grande Foundation email list. Wally, I talked last week in our conversation about the Guessing family moving to homeschooling and what all that means. But the folks at the New York Times, of all places, published a very interesting chart showing that homeschooling is not necessarily just for the rich and well-off. You can find this at heirsofenchantment.com, July 23rd, 2020. What basically is addressed here is that all families with kids, so non-homeschooling, have slightly higher incomes than homeschoolers. Now, this isn't entirely surprising. If you look at data, it's a chicken or the egg situation. Most families nowadays have two parents that work. Taking one of those families outside of the workforce, at least the earning income economy, will result in some lower incomes. But all families with kids, 33.8% make more than $100,000. Homeschooling, 18.9%. Interestingly enough, also below 50,000. So you're talking not low income necessarily, but a slightly higher percentage of those folks also are homeschoolers as opposed to all families with kids. Just an interesting note indicating that homeschooling can be an accessible proposition for folks who are not necessarily well off. And it's going to be critical in these days with so much concern surrounding the K-12 system. I think folks are going to need a lot of encouragement and a lot of data and information to show that they can indeed do this for their children.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you've alluded to it many times, is there are so many challenges facing our students today with COVID. Distance learning has its huge challenges, particularly if you have any difficulties learning, including anything to do with concentration, our whole host of ADD, you have learning disabilities and the like. And the whole simple fact that my go-to is second graders don't seem to do as well on Zoom as maybe focused middle-aged and older professionals. So, we'll see how all that does. And I could see, yeah, if I had school-age children, I think homeschooling might be something I would be looking at as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And also on the education front, an article was flagged in the relating to the governor's recent orders. Private schools will have to adhere to at least some of the governor's orders. This is from New Mexico Political Report. When it comes to starting school after the Labor Day holiday, private schools will not necessarily have to abide by that specific aspect of what the governor is saying, but they will have to require, there will be requirements on the mask issue, as well as capacity being below 25% of fire code. Now, I know from personal experience, tracking down what's going on in a lot of private schools, that there's going to be some level of civil disobedience here. And there's also going to be a lot of innovation happening at private schools around our state. But it'll be a very interesting, this is one of those maybe restaurants 2.0. Restaurants kind of have been the tip of the spear so far in terms of pushback against the governor. But if there's a crackdown coming from Santa Fe in terms of private schools, and there's not that many of them, the state police certainly could pay visits to a lot of these schools and really come down hard on them if they choose to. It's going to be very interesting to see how things shake out with regard to the education system. But, a lot of times you see private behind a school name and you think, well, they can kind of do their own thing. That is not necessarily the case with regard to COVID-19. And there's going to be some level of friction there between state policymakers, the governor, David Scrace, et cetera, and certain private schools as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And the other one that seems like nationally and maybe less so in New Mexico in terms of being disproportionately impacted, but they still have is the churches or the other ones that are a candidate for that. I've seen some interesting political cartoons where churches aren't allowed to worship, but casinos are allowed to be open. Mm-hmm. And so, the plan was the church is going to put slot machines in their sanctuary and call it a casino. So, the point is that you alluded to it. I'll say it just as strongly as I can, is to, instead of doing all these little details, have these high level principles for all businesses in certain categories, and don't slice it and dice it. So finally, it's not working. It just upsets everybody. It takes away all the basically moral power you have in terms of doing something that's fair, effective, and right. And so it's like and it started off on a really bad foot with that regard. We did the essential, non-essential. And, my favorite quote that I probably say it 4 times a week is that, to what person does their job not seem essential? What business says what I provide is not essential? Now, does that mean you need it for the next week or people will die? No, but, businesses fulfill needs, and the employees that work in those businesses, the owners that own them, that is their livelihood. And to say, oh, no, you can't do that, when this business that's very similar gets to do it using these high set of rules. Why don't we apply those a little more uniformly?
Yeah, and I'm sure, like you said, private schools will be innovating in this area. One of the things I could really see them doing is, especially in the fall, outdoor educational experiences, whether it's sitting under kind of a tent situation and talking, or getting out of the classroom, field trip kind of thing. Now, of course, unfortunately, the zoo, the biopark, a lot of the places you would take kids to learn some of these, things that they would otherwise be learning are going to be closed. But I could definitely see some level of innovation there in terms of outdoor education. And going back to ancient Greece, a lot of people learned a lot of very important and valuable lessons out of doors, and that could be a creative solution. But time will tell, and I promise you there will be some friction there unless the governor just kind of capitulates and doesn't do anything to go after these private schools. Now, changing gears significantly, you know, Wally, I was just thinking the other day, and sometimes that's dangerous, but I was wondering how oil production had been affected in the state of New Mexico. We, of course, follow energy issues closely. The financial aspect has been very significant, but I was just wondering, gee, how much has oil production dropped in the state? So I went online to the Oil Conservation Division's website. Again, you can find this link and chart at heirsoфenchantment.com, and it's just the latest on oil production in New Mexico. So through May, which is the latest full month data we have, we've seen a 21.67% decrease since the start of the year in oil production. And, you know, I think that is significant information and data. That's certainly a counter to the trend that we had been seeing, where production in New Mexico was rising and rising very quickly, and of course, revenues alongside of it. But as we have seen companies stop drilling, even I'm sure some of them plugging up wells or abandoning production at certain wells. Is that surprising to you? Do you think that's about what you would have expected in terms of production declines since under COVID-19?
Well, you know, I guess I would say I was expecting somewhere, you know, between 15% and a third, you know, decline. So I guess I'm not surprised with that. But the thing that did surprise me was how well the drilling rig count is holding in. You know, New Mexico is way above 100. Mm-hmm. Well, we're at 51, and the last few weeks, it's not been going down any further. So oil, last I checked, was in the 40s, you know, and so can you drill new wells at $40 oil and, you know, break even and position yourself if there's a run up? And the answer is maybe so. So maybe things aren't as drastic as they were during the dreaded negative oil day, you know, when demand just came crashing down in a high supply side, when, you know, in the U.S. there was no way to get rid of the oil. The other thing that led me to believe that this drilling rig count was not low is that gross receipts tax has not gone down as much as people expect, and a lot of it is attributed to the construction sector. Well, a lot of the construction sector probably relates to some of those 51 drilling rigs that's going on. You know, there's a lot of pipe that needs to be extended, and it's always you know, I worked in the oil and gas industry for many years, and it's always a little shaky to categorize what industries certain activities have. But, you know, a drilling rig that, you know, will account for, you know, pick a number, 50 to 75 direct full-time employees. That's a lot of people doing a lot of things, and there's still more than 50 of those operating in New Mexico. So somewhat encouraging. You know, because there aren't 100 drilling rigs operating on our side of the Permian Basin, you know, maybe prices will go up at some point and position the state even better. The one thing we know about oil prices, though, Paul, can guarantee you they're going to go up and they're going to go down, and they do it many times, sometimes quicker than we can even guess that it would happen.
Well, I'm going to say that we're not too far below where we were before the price war and COVID-19 started. Remember, the Saudis and the Russians had a price war about oil production, trying to put some frackers out of business. I haven't followed that price war, but I think it kind of fizzled with regard to those two countries flooding the market. So we're back close to $40 a barrel. And obviously, this Permian Basin, I called it the low-cost leader, the Walmart of oil and gas production here. So New Mexico is well-positioned in a relatively cost-constrained environment to continue producing a decent amount of oil. Obviously, the production has dropped significantly, but you know, if prices were to go up, I could see that situation turning around. What worries me is, you know, just with the more lockdown situation here in New Mexico, across the country, if we further those lockdowns, what could that mean for our economy overall and oil production. You're right about the gross receipts tax, and that is something that admittedly we kind of got wrong at the Rio Grande Foundation. We thought they were going to be plummeting dramatically for local governments and the state government. Construction, I think the area where it's really come on strong is you're seeing a lot of home improvement projects around the house. People are investing money in their homes, recreating outdoors, and staying sane in general while they are cooped up at their house. And they feel that investing in that, whether it's just a short-term winner while you're locked down due to COVID, or a long-term winner in the value of your house moving forward, building that swimming pool you've been talking about, improving that patio so you can enjoy the outdoors, all of those things are kind of becoming more and more relevant to people in their spending. And so that's driving GRTs.
Yeah, and, I live in a relatively new neighborhood where you wouldn't think there'd be huge home improvement projects, but during the lockdown, there were a lot of garage doors open with people building a lot of things in their homes. So
yeah, and it's still locked down, and there's still a lot of people doing that kind of thing. And real quickly, we have just a few minutes. The legislature commissioned a report about essentially single payer or socialized medicine in the state of New Mexico. Basically, what they did is they assumed, all the federal dollars and all the money we have now in the state taking control and providing health care for everybody. Unless there is some new tax or new funding source, federal government under a Biden administration rolls in and provides a lot more money for health care at the state level, New Mexico would be expected to have a $5.8 billion shortfall over 5 years, the first 5 years of that program. And normally those are
$1 billion and a change every year.
Yeah,
to make
normally
that happen.
those are starting points if you follow, Medicare, Medicaid, and some of these past government programs that have been put in place. Out of a $7 billion general fund budget, you're talking about over 1/7 of that entire budget would be the shortfall that we would experience due to this new healthcare entitlement. That is a post including relevant links from July 22nd over at Heirs of Enchantment. It was covered dutifully by the Journal, but as is usually the case when anybody throws cold water on the massive expansion of government, you don't get the follow-on op-eds and discussion of those kinds of things because we're one of the few organizations in New Mexico that actually calls BS when it comes to the latest expansion of government. Now, Wally, I would be remiss before we go. There was a wonderful article in Monday in the Santa Fe New Mexican, a profile of Carol White, the tireless leader of New Mexico's Restaurant Association. And rarely are people on the right side of the political spectrum treated to this kind of glowing attention from media outlets in our state, especially the Santa Fe New Mexican. But really, they did a great job of talking about the dedication that Carol has to trying to represent her industry in a very challenging time, taking a principled opposition perspective and really sharing what needs to be done to keep this industry alive with all of its mom and pop businesses and all the challenges they face. So definitely worth checking out that Santa Fe New Mexican piece.
Yeah, and a picture of her with a fly rod in her hand to make the whole story complete. So
yes, and Wally and Carol are married, so I'm the one that gets to speak in all the glowing terms. Wally can just nod his head in approval and say yes. Everything you said, Paul, I'll put that on the latest anniversary card or whatever the next holiday is.
Yeah.
So that's where we're going to have to leave it, folks. So much still happening. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.